was not as much as created as a result of the Santan Kotais. So they would need, for example, they would need animals, horses to transport their goods, their tents and their entire paraphernalia from one place to the other. They would require all kinds of luxurious items in order to maintain the two households, and their families were in Edo, they were in the fiefs, and there was a certain kind of a glory that was attached to the status of the daimyo. So as the need for these non-essential, luxurious items increased, the need for money economy, the need to get money in exchange for rice obviously increased, and here the rice brokers or the Budasashi came to the rescue of the daimyo, and we see a growing proximity. So there was always a tradition of the daimyo depending upon financial or some kind of a support, monetary support or economic support, because rice economy was the one that dominated. But for say carrying out the barter system, there was a dependence on the merchants who controlled the networks within the four islands, among the four islands. But this kind of dependency had never been seen in the earlier period. So we have creation of what is called the daimyo chonin alliance becoming stronger, and they were now coming together. Now another change that is coming about is when you have a rush of population towards living in Edo. Some kind of permanent residences were also established in Edo in order to sustain the families of the daimyo. So naturally, Edo becomes a very strong demographic center, and there is a lot of convergence that is happening in Edo, where people are coming at different points of time for the purpose of fulfilling the demands of the Sankin Kotai system. So a very significant change that probably was going unnoticed by the Tokugawas was the changing character of the city of Edo, because Edo had always been seen as a political headquarter, not as a cultural center, not as a place which has a strong demographic pressure, not as a place that was dealing with economic aspects, because for that Osaka and other commercial towns were there. But Edo was emerging, along with being the political headquarter. There was a gradual superimposition of a cultural pattern, some kind of a meeting point. So it had become a meeting point where people would get an opportunity to meet for the first time without any licenses, without any restrictions, and to share their grudges, to share their grievances. And the daimyo, as well as the other feudal classes, and all those people who were now converging to Edo, they were now forming a group that may be called a like-minded group, who had similar kind of problems with the Tokugawa shogunate. So it emerged as a cultural center. It started emerging, it started kind of pushing back the political character, and as a cultural center, as a meeting point, it began to have somewhat a national character, cosmopolitan and a national character, in the sense that people from different parts of Japan were now having an opportunity, perhaps for the first time, to interact with one another. And this makes Edo into a city, into a center which was completely unimagined, unexpected by the Tokugawa shoguns. They had created Edo in order to keep themselves away from Kyoto, from the imperial interference, and to keep their power concentrated. But Edo very soon started showing symptoms and signs of becoming a center of anti-Bakufu alliance. So whatever alliances were formed, they began to be formed in Edo. Edo also acquires a character of a marketplace, because there are luxurious houses and luxurious residences that are coming up in Edo. So for the merchants, Edo acquires a lot of importance, and they travel to Edo in order to fulfill the regular and the ever-growing demands of the luxurious households and the families that are living there, that want to spend money on items, on commodities that are symbolic of their glorious character, of their somewhat privileged position. So this is a change that is pointed out by Andrew Gordon, and we must keep this change in mind when we are talking about how and when the anti-Bakufu alliance was taking a concrete shape. Then, besides the Sankin Kotai system that obviously impacted the daimyo the most, we have a corresponding, a parallel system that the daimyo unofficially, informally began to impose, began to apply on the retainers, on the samurai. And this was because the daimyos were becoming more and more impoverished, they needed to extract more money, and they also feared that the samurai might delink themselves from the bonds of loyalty. And in order to do that, whatever they had experienced or whatever they were experiencing was transferred onto their retainers. Now, I needed a whiteboard, but doesn't matter. Every daimyo in the fief had a central castle town. The daimyo, his close members of the bureaucracy, administrative staff, family, they all lived in that castle town, just like you have Edo as the center. Then, in that fief, there were villages, there were rural areas, the countryside, where the samurai were spread out. And they would simply come to the castle town in the event of depositing the revenues that they had collected from their respective places, or if there was any urgency of administrative issue or administrative nature. Otherwise, they were quite independent. The samurai stayed in their respective areas and they carried out the administrative duties as per the procedures that were usually followed. And there was no such active interaction between the two. Sense of loyalty, the bonds that existed were enough to carry out this kind of an administration in a fairly reliable manner. But what happened when the Sankin Kotai system was rigidly imposed on the daimyo? They began the process, they began the practice of making the samurai under force to stay in the castle towns. So the samurai were instructed that they must have a residence in the castle towns, and just as the families were held hostage in Edo, similarly the families of the samurai were also forced to live in the castle towns. The samurai were also lived in the castle town under the watchful eye of the daimyo. And this was also done because every now and then the daimyo had to travel with all the retainers, all the major role players in administration to Edo. So it was best to keep an eye on the samurai. Now, how did the samurai respond to it? Obviously, the samurai were very unhappy because that took away their independence, that took away their autonomy. They lost the chance of cultivating the field during the time when they wanted to do that, and they were doing it quite often in order to add to their incomes, because they were after all dependent only on the stipends that were given, fixed stipends that were given to them by the daimyo. So this again brought in a lot of change, not just in the attitude of the samurai, but we also find that these castle towns also began to attain a different character. They became marketplaces, because here again, like in the case of Edo, you have more and more residences, the demographic pattern changes, and this market network required interaction, regular interaction with the chonin. That is the merchants. The merchants are the ones who are looking after the needs of Edo. So they were removed from the countryside and they were kind of concentrated in the castle towns, where they would work under direct supervision of the daimyo, the lord, or his trusted ministers, or his trusted bureaucrats. So apart from changing the character of the samurai itself, it also brought about a change in the character of the locale where the samurai and the daimyo, the feudal classes, function. And of course, this entire change was further speeded up by the very rapid growth of money economy. Money economy had come into being as a result of long period of peace and prosperity, and then money economy got a further boost, further push as a result of the changing character of the cities. So commercial cities like Osaka assumed a lot of importance. Political centers like Edo and the places where castle towns were, the forts were located, they also underwent a change. So money economy got a further boost. And that brought in a kind of a dent in the pre-existing feudal relationships that we have existing in Japan for many, many centuries. So this was a very gradual but a very definite kind of a transformation that we come across happening, particularly in the countryside, and this involved the daimyo, this involved the merchants, this involved the samurai as well. Then there was another factor that can be cited in order to understand as to why the samurai were so unhappy. What was the reason behind the presence of this, or existence behind this very strong group of soldiers? The reason was feudal anarchy. There was constant wars that were going on in Japan for many, many centuries, and particularly serious was the position or the conditions that were prevailing between, say, 15th century, mid 15th century, and 16th century. That is the time 1450s or 1460s to say 1603. 1550s. And then, of course, gradually the Tokugawas come to power. But the Tokugawa position or the Tokugawa takeover of power was preceded by almost more than 100 years of feudal anarchy. And at that point of time, the glory and the status of the samurai had risen very, very rapidly. It had risen to the highest pedestal. You cannot do anything without the presence of the samurai. So the samurai had a very glorious past, and not without reason. They had a definite function that they were playing. Now what happened with the beginning of the Tokugawa era? There was a period of peace, no wars were fought. The Tokugawas established their sole control. There was a situation of stability, political stability, and the samurai found itself becoming idle, without any work. And since birth determined their status in society, they were all the more troubled because they could not even, and they were not capable of taking over any other profession. They could not just simply move to trade and commerce, because that would be undermining their position, and they did not even have the expertise or the experience to do so, because birth had always been the deciding factor. So their jobs in course of the early Tokugawa period became restricted to collection of revenues. And with the movement, with the shift of the samurai from the castle, from the various parts of the field to the castle towns, further damaged them. Because whatever opportunity they had in the countryside while they were in the villages to cultivate land in times of peace, because that would add to their income, that opportunity was also taken away from them. And they were simply doing sundry jobs, they were doing administrative duties for which they got a fixed stipend. Then there was a fall in the fixed stipend also, because as the impoverishment of the daimyo increased, and as the daimyo became more and more concerned with regard to the financial issues, they brought down the stipends of the samurai. So the samurai found itself not just deprived of their past glory, the samurai also found itself being forcibly deprived of the opportunities of adding to their income. And then, of course, they were finding themselves becoming more and more dependent on the highly reduced stipends that they were now dependent upon, that they were now getting from their respective lords. So professionally, they were a dissatisfied lot. They became a class of privileged idlers, just going into the villages, collecting revenues, and not enjoying any superior power over the population, something that they did in the past, because they were regularly present, they were permanently there, and they would have a fair amount of grip on the people who were living in a particular village. So they found themselves somewhat incapable of adjusting to this new situation. So we find that as a result of this, there was a great amount of disenchantment, there was a great amount of sense of loss, and they would simply recite and they would simply narrate the stories of their glorious ancestors in order to cling on to their past positions or their past status. But in reality, there was nothing that was happening in the present times, in their times of the Tokugawa period, that was similar to the times that they talked about. So the times that they talked about were full of achievements, of heroic victories, and of course also traditional practices of committing harakiri. So there were a lot of kind of glory that was attached to the position of the samurai. Now everything seems to have been lost. So as a result of that, there was anger. And the anger was not just towards their immediate overlord, the anger was against the system, against the shogun, who had been instrumental in making the daimyo, the lord, as well as the samurai suffer. And that is why we have indications of many samurai having a greater sympathy for their lord rather than for the shogun, because shogun was a distant character, but shogun was responsible, and the shogunate, the system itself, the Bakuhan system itself, had failed. And what the indication of this kind of growing disillusionment was that in course of time, again it's a very gradual process, many of the samurai, they started distancing themselves from the system. They started moving away, to begin with, from their lords, and because of their moving away from their respective lords, to whom they were very loyal to at one point of time, they started becoming distant and somewhat withdrawn from the system of the shogunate. And they started looking for other opportunities. Of course, the common feature amongst all these samurai was that they were filled with hatred towards the shogun and towards the system that had made them highly dependent on the law, and they were going through a very difficult time. So that gives rise to the term. There's a term that is used for these samurai who delink themselves. Not all, but a fair number of samurai. The term that is used is ronin, R-O-N-I-N. So this term literally means the wandering men. People who are wandering. Not wandering, but wandering. Moving from one place to the other. Something that was unthinkable, unimaginable, as far as the fixed positions of the past are concerned. So they are the wandering men who owed loyalty to no one. Not to the lord, not to the shogun. So a large number of ronins emerged out of the disenchantment that is going on in the countryside. And some of these ronins, of course, they went to the cities. They, out of their curiosity, because they were learned men, they started undertaking academic pursuits. They started studying Western works. They started doing a lot of introspection as to why all this is happening, what is wrong with the traditional aspects or traditional setup, and they become carriers of new ideas, particularly in urban Japan, in the urban areas, because they were looking for alternative livelihood, and they were also a curious lot. Remember, Tokugawa period never ever crushed curious minds. So there were a lot of libraries, there were a lot of centers of discussion that had always prevailed in the Tokugawa period, not just in the urban centers but in the rural areas. So it is not surprising that this group of ronin consisted of the future academics or the future learned men or the future scholars who were now getting more and more familiar with the Western ideas, with the Western practices, and they were keen to bring about a change in the Japanese society. So they were a large number of ronins who remained in the countryside but delinked from the system, filled with hatred towards the shogun, particularly towards the shogun, and they were the carriers of the anti-Bakufu sentiments. The urban areas, the ones who went and pursued Western knowledge, they contributed to the anti-Tokugawa sentiment in a different way by instilling ideas that were drawn from and borrowed from the Western country. So both kinds of ronin, the ones who stayed in the countryside and the ones who stayed in Edo, and the ones who pursued new kinds of ideas, both of them contributed to the formation of the anti-Bakufu alliance. And they joined hands with the disgruntled daimyo, and they joined hands with the disgruntled merchants, that is, chonin. So we begin to see a kind of an alliance that emerges due to all these factors, particularly related to the Sunken Kotai system, and we find the formation of what is popularly known as the Daimyo Ronin Shonin alliance, something that you'll come across many times when you're talking about the decline of the Tokugawas and when you're talking about the emergence of the Meiji period or the reasons that led to the Meiji Restoration. It is often called a result of the Daimyo Ronin Shonin alliance. So you should be familiar with this formation that comes into being because of and it is also called feudal merchant alliance. Feudal classes represented by daimyo and ronins, merchants obviously the chonin. So these terms, feudal merchant alliance or ronin chonin, daimyo ronin chonin alliance, DRC, is something that will keep coming up when we are talking about this particular phase of Japanese history. But was the daimyo ronin chonin alliance alone responsible? Of course, there were other factors. But before we go on to the other factors which corresponded or which joined hands with this anti-Bakufu alliance, I would just briefly want to talk about the role played by the merchants. We have been talking about how the merchants, despite being, finding themselves in the midst of highly restrictive kind of policies or regulations, the merchants played their role in disturbing the feudal balance or in disturbing the balance that was existing in Japan. But the interesting feature that we find is that the merchants, despite their economic wealth, and despite the fact that the feudal classes were becoming more and more dependent on them, the merchants never took a lead in the anti-Bakufu alliance. And there were reasons for that, which I'll just cover. The merchants contributed to the fall of the Tokugawas, but unlike in the Western societies, where merchants become carriers of new principles, carriers of revolution, carriers of ideas like democracy, liberalism, etc., and major transformations, in Japan and also in China, this never happened. The merchants played a secondary role, but the merchants were definitely role players. As far as the merchants are concerned, we find that the merchants were very important for the Bakufu also. The Bakufu, of course, mainly depended on the peasants, mainly depended on the agrarian revenues, but a fair amount of Bakufu financial backing came from the trade. Although it was limited, it was much less than the agrarian revenues, but there was trade that was going on in Japan, especially internal trade that we have. And despite the restrictive maritime policy, the Bakufu would extract some kind of an additional amount from the merchants as well. But merchants were always held under suspicion. They were always looked upon with contempt, with a great amount of suspicion because of the combination of money and foreign contact. That was considered to be a potential threat. They had money and they were also the ones who came most in contact with the outsiders. So what could be more threatening than that? So they were kept under a lot of control, and we begin to see the change only when money economy begins to assume importance. There is a greater amount of dependence that the feudal classes, more than ever before, begin to have on the merchants. And the merchants, they obviously assume a very important position. They had always lacked social prestige. Now they were looking for what they had never been granted by the Tokugawas. And that is what brings about a change in the relationship between the merchants and the feudal classes. And they enter into a relationship which I've just explained to you, which led to the formation of the anti-Bakufu alliance. Now, the social repercussions and the social results of this rising importance of the merchants were many. What we begin to see as the feudal classes begin to come closer to the merchants is that despite the hierarchical divisions and despite the rigidity with which these hierarchical divisions were put in place, we find that the merchants gradually, they begin to find avenues of getting adopted into samurai families or getting into marriage alliances with the samurai families. Very rarely with the daimyo families, because daimyos were much elevated, they were on a pedestal. But with samurai families, the incidence and the numbers of adoptions of merchants into these families and of marriage alliances, they become very, very common in course of the latter part of the Tokugawa period. And this can be very clearly understood because we find that it was a two-way process. The samurai trying to improve their economic position by getting into an alliance with the merchants. The merchants, on the other hand, trying to get social prestige, contacts, political contacts by getting into some kind of a permanent relationship with the samurai family. So this trend was becoming very common, and this trend is very symbolic, because this trend not only indicates to us the obvious, that is anger towards the Bakufu becoming very strong. This trend, more than anything else, indicates how the feudal structure was going to be collapsing very soon. the imminence and the inevitability of the collapse of the feudal structure begins to show itself as soon as these alliances and uh, these incidents of adoptions and marriage alliances become more and more frequent. So that indicates a breakdown of the feudal structure. So it is not just a political consequence that it has a lot of social and economic consequence also, which in turn helps in bringing about the Meiji Restoration. So politically, we have the downfall of the Tokugawas. Socially and economically, it is a new system that is now coming into being. The question that arises over here is that if the merchants were so powerful and there were so many feudal classes that were dependent on it, why is it that the merchants did not carry the flag of revolt against the Tokugawa? This was because of the continuity of the restrictions. The Tokugawas also realized the economic importance of the merchants. And there were many incidents, many cases in the past when money was, or rice was borrowed, or some kind of an economic support was sought by none other than the shogunate from the leading shonen families. And their importance, of course, increased because of the growing demand for Japanese commodities like silk and paper. But at the same time, the Tokugawas were dominated with a sense of insecurity. So they did not withdraw any of the restrictions. They did not show any kind of change in the attitude. And therefore, the restrictions continue. Even during this very, very significant change that is happening at the level of society, polity, economy, the restrictions do not get withdrawn at any point in time. And that is what perhaps kept the merchants away from having played a direct role. They played a role, but not a leading role. The leadership was left with the feudal classes. But when the downfall happened, we find that the merchants went all out to support the anti-Bakufu alliance. They did everything possible in order to make the end of the Tokugawas possible, because that was in their interest. But an actual role, so this is very similar to what we see in China. Merchants never became the leaders of any revolution, whether it was 1911 revolution, whether it was any other change that happened. It was the others who did that. Same is the case with Japan, and that is why we say that in Japan, the revolutionary change came about from above. It was not initiated from below. The merchants did not play a predominant or a leadership role ever, because they remained under the psychological and the centuries-old character that was imposed upon them. Now, there is another section of society that we need to discuss in terms of its role in bringing about this transformation, and this is again a section which constitutes the largest percentage in Japanese population, just like in the case of China. And this is one section of society that ought to have played a major role in bringing down the Tokugawas, the peasants. What about the peasants? And why is it that the peasants were not, initiating, putting pressure from below? Now, as far as the Chinese peasants are concerned, they were an exploited lot, there is no doubt about it. Also, their condition not only became worse because of as we enter the latter phase of the Tokugawa shogunate, the Sankin Kotai system created a lot of financial pressure. The financial pressure was put on to the shoulders of the peasants. And the daimyo and the feudal classes started extracting more and more rice revenue from them in order to fulfill their own economic treasury and their economic, their corpus. In course of time, money economy comes into being. This is from, say, latter part of the 18th century. That increased the peasants' profits for two reasons. One reason was that a part of the revenues that were demanded from the peasants were now demanded in form of money. So the peasants were expected to arrange for that money. Now, conventionally, the Japanese peasants, by and large, had always been away from market networks. The market network was dominated by the merchants and by the feudal classes. So, who would take the rice to the market, the pricing of the rice, the exchange of rice for other commodities, and then, of course, the exchange of rice for money. All that was carried out by sections other than the peasants. The peasants were there only working and generating, kind of the economy by contributing in the form of rice. But now they had to arrange for the money. So that brought the merchants, the peasants, close to the choice. The ordinary peasant, who would he go to? He would not be able to carry the rice to the markets, to the local markets and exchange. He was dependent on the local merchants, on the local money lenders. And as a result of that, the problems that were faced by the peasants obviously increased, because that meant traveling, that meant getting into the system of which the peasants had absolutely no experience. The second problem was that the peasants, in order to fulfill the ever-growing demands of the daimyo and the samurai, had to produce more. And in order to produce more, the peasants would now have to become dependent on using new kinds of implements, using new kinds of fertilizers, manure, seeds. The Tokugawas did take a lot of interest in the improvement of agriculture. But now it became absolutely imperative, it became essential for the peasants to purchase these new methods by which they could increase their yield. That again created problems, because all these paraphernalia that was required for improvement of yield were available only in exchange for money, cash, and they would have to go to the market. So the peasants, who in any case were a burden and an exploited lot, they also started feeling very uncomfortable in the new situation that they were forced to enter. And that part of it, of course, was due to the Sankin Kotai system. Part of it was due to the fact that the Tokugawas were no longer taking any interest in the welfare of the peasants. As long as the peasants could be squeezed and the maximum could be extracted, it did not matter to them at all. And of course, we find that because of the Sankin Kotai system, public works were also getting neglected. Because the daimyos were traveling from the villages, from the countryside to the town of Edo, therefore public works which needed a regular repair. Remember, I told you that no repair, no construction, no maintenance of public works could ever take place without the prior approval of the shogun. So as financial constraints began to increase, so did the disinterest of the daimyo in maintenance of these public works, which created more problems for the peasants during natural calamities, for example. So they were also a very, very discontented lot. They expressed their discontent either passively or actively. Female infanticide became very common. Sale of children becomes very common during this period. And as far as the active aspect is concerned, peasant revolts, uncoordinated, localized, but occurring very frequently, they also become a phenomenon of this period. So peasant revolts also start taking place in much higher numbers. Of course, most of these peasant revolts were not really impactful, because they were spontaneous, they were badly organized, and they were uncoordinated. But there was a discontent that was brewing at the lower levels. Not strong enough to bring about the transformation from below, but strong enough or important enough to bring about some kind of a stirring in the feudal areas or in the socio-economic structures. So we find that the peasants, because of these conditions, they were absolutely in favor, and they were more or less absolutely in line with what the anti-Bakufu alliance was spreading or was intending to acquire. So the downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate, or the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, did not really trouble them. The idea of the Tokugawa shogunate being replaced by some other power was not really unwelcome to them. They may not have taken a direct position, or they may not have played a very visible or a direct role, but they went along with the sentiments that were prevalent. And in course of this discontentment, we find that, like the Ronin, many of the peasants also migrated to cities. They also broke away from the traditional loyalty, bonds of loyalty, And in the cities, they were desperately trying to find alternative sources of livelihood, because back home there was nothing that was waiting for them. Back home, they were dependent. Their right to cultivate land was taken away. Many of them, most of them were in very, they had taken huge loans from the local money lender, and the local money lender was invariably a local merchant or a local samurai. So these money lenders also, kind of added to the misery of the peasants. So many of them went to the cities, and once they went to the cities, they kind of broke away from the shackles of the framework that the Tokugawas had put in place. So they kind of revolted, and they broke away, and they dealing themselves from the framework of feudalism. So when the feudal structure started crumbling, and anti-Bakufu alliance formed became a very concrete kind of a structure, the peasants went along, and they were absolutely fine with the idea of a major transformation. So this is the role that the peasants play. So again, the pressure is not created from below, it is the change that is coming from above. Another example that can be cited with regard to the change that is coming from above, we can talk about a class which may have been a very small class in terms of numbers, but it was a highly influential section of the imperial court. Way back, when imperial power was still enjoying a reasonable amount of significance, and even after the aristocracy had taken over, the imperial power was not completely siphoned. So I'm talking about the period before 9th century and the period after 9th century till the time the 10th government comes into significance. And even after the 10th government came into existence, 1180, we find that this section of society remained quite important. So this section of society, in fact, was the one that represented the cultural aspect of the imperial court. Heian culture, Nara culture, then Edo culture, all of them are known for certain ideas that are associated with splendor, glory, luxury, privilege, and so on. So we find that this was a section of society that had come into existence as the imperial authority or imperial institution came into existence. This was the very selected group of court nobility. I'm not talking about the administrative power players or administrative people. I'm talking about a highly refined, something like you have in the Mughal court, you have the gems known for their poetic brilliance, known for their artistic frame of mind, and so on. Welcome after a very long time. Come on, time. So similarly, there was a court nobility which had come into existence, and this was called Kuge. K-U-G-E. Kuge. K-U-G-E. And this was a pre-feudal class. It had come into existence much before the 10th government had come into existence. And its history went back into several centuries of glory, where they represented the high culture of Japan, they represented the literary and the artistic skills of Japan, and they were like symbolic figures. They were not playing any administrative role, but they were a highly privileged lot who enjoyed the patronage of the imperial court. And their existence therefore goes back to a very long period. Now this Kuge began to sense a gradual loss in their status over a period of time, as we find imperial institution becoming secondary in course of the primacy, the predominance of the aristocracy. Then as we have the 10th government coming into being, the imperial institution was losing its, its political and its social importance. It was becoming more and more sacred. But the worst period was the Tokugawa, which consciously and knowingly pushed the imperial institution totally into a secondary position by finding a new headquarter, that was Edo. So Kyoto became the place where the emperor would reside, the royal family would reside, and all those appendages of the imperial splendor would be there. But bereft of any of the privileges that had been granted to them. Kuge was one such class that suffered. So their privileged status got a dent. It got dented because of the withdrawal of financial backing. And they started living, many of the Kuge, and there were a large number who had always learned to live in glory, in a lot of luxury and so on. They began to lose their splendor, and many of the Kuge, they were reduced to absolute penury. They were impoverished, and they were full of anger towards the Tokugawas, because the Tokugawas were the ones who were responsible. So when the opposition against the Tokugawa began to gather momentum, the Kuge gave that leadership to this movement. By themselves, the court nobility was not capable of taking to arms or to fight battles, but they represented the imperial institution, and they became representatives of the acceptance and of the approval of the imperial institution to whatever was going on. So they contributed to the entire act of legitimizing the anti-Bakufu movement. Now, in addition to that, we also have the role played by natural calamities. So along with all these changes that I've talked about, it just so happened that series of natural calamities, which were of course not uncommon, they hit Japan at this opportune moment. And these natural calamities occurred at a time when public works were not in a state of regular repair or regular maintenance. The situation worsened the conditions that were prevailing in the countryside, suffering in the rural areas increased many times, and that obviously led to a higher number of peasant revolts, both passive as well as active. Peasant opposition, which was indicated both passively in the form of female infanticide, sale of children, suicides. Suicides became very common, and then of course in the form of active opposition, which came to be seen in almost every part of rural Japan in the form of peasant revolts. So it was a coming together of all these conditions that ultimately reached a point of no return, and this was in the mid-19th century. Mid-19th century was a time when all the disgruntled sections of traditional feudal society, they came out openly against the Bakufu, be it the daimyo, and here I am talking about the Fudai daimyo also. Shimpan, no. Shimpan were kinsmen, and therefore there is no evidence of any of the Shimpan families, relatives who were joining them. But Fudai, a fair number of Fudai, not all, they joined hands. And then of course to back them were the Tozama daimyos. So, and then the samurai, mainly the Ronins, who felt absolutely cheated by the Tokugawa system, and they found absolute justification in betraying them. Then we have, of course, the role played by the peasants, role played by the merchants, of course, and the Kuge. All of them, they joined and came out openly against the Bakufu in strong protest. And those who saw this as the best time to carry out a direct attack on the Tokugawas were the four predominant Tozama clans. The four predominant Tozama clans: Tosa, Hizen, Satsuma, and you better remember Toshu. Now these are names of places, and I've sent a couple of maps to you yesterday. So they show you the places which were occupied by Satsuma. How many of you have seen the Google Classroom? There are only 61 people who joined, 61 who seem to have joined the Google Classroom, and I don't know what's going on with the rest of people. Please join it, because now I've sent the readings. I've also asked you to prepare for the tutorials in the coming week. Okay, so look at the maps, and the next thing that I would be doing is that I'll send you consolidated maps from ancient period, medieval period, right up till the 20th century. So keep that as the base for all the topics, because I want you to have all those maps which cover the 20th century as well. But these two maps that I've sent you will give you a fair amount of clarity with regard to the locales and the geographical positions. So we find that now what was needed? Everything seems to have been there. Now what was needed was an ideology, a symbol, which would bring together everyone, which could, kind of give a sense of unity of purpose to anyone, and a kind of a slogan that would carry forward and make it easier for launching a movement. And it is at this point of time that a slogan was consciously created. And that slogan was Sun No, S-O-N hyphen N-O. Sun No, S-O-N hyphen N-O, which means revere the emperor, or worship, honor the emperor. So what could be better than getting legitimacy from none other than the sacred emperor who comes from the family of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So the anti-Bakufu alliance, the people who were part of that alliance and others who were unhappy with the Tokugawas, found it most feasible, pragmatic, to draw the emperor into the picture and launch an attack on the Tokugawas with the legitimacy and with the justification and with the approval of none other than the emperor. Obviously, that would give a huge amount of strength to the entire movement. So the symbol of the emperor, and they had reason to do it, because the emperor had indeed been pushed into the background. The emperor had indeed been shown a secondary or placed in a secondary position. There were many, many instances in course of the latter part of the Tokugawas when very major decisions were taken by the Tokugawas without the stamp of the emperor, which was something unimaginable, which was something which created a lot of anger amongst those who considered the emperor the ultimate authority, religious, political, social. So the Tokugawas had actually brought it upon them. They had not just geographically removed themselves from Kyoto, they had also created a sense as if the emperor is nothing but just a deity, just a god who should be worshipped, with absolutely no active role or passive role being played in the politics of the administration. So now at this point of time, there was revival and restoration of the emperor's position, and that worked very well as far as getting approval for all the acts that were carried out by the anti-Tokugawa group, and the use of the emperor's name gave the much needed legitimacy, political legitimacy, to challenge a rule that had been there for centuries. They had been in power since 1603, and almost for more than 2 centuries they had been in existence. So that legitimacy was very, very useful for the anti-Bakufu alliance. Of course, when we talk about the actual leadership, it was in the hands of the Tozama clans, the 4 predominant Tozama clans. Now, we have already talked about the internal contradictions, the internal crisis, which of course assumes a lot of importance. But we cannot totally ignore the external pressures also. And I'll just briefly take you across the external pressure, and then of course the references that I've shared with you talk about that. Now, if you look at the 2 books that I've shared with you, one is Kenneth Piley, the other one is Beasley, W.G. Beasley, which is called Meiji Restoration. I've shared the text for both the topics because they are related with one another. Okay, so if you look at Beasley, the first I think the first few chapters deal with Tokugawa downfall. And they are very well written and very, very with great amount of clarity. Although I've not suggested that for your tutorial reading, but Beasley is a good book for both these topics, Tokugawa downfall and for the Meiji Restoration. And so is Kenneth Pyle. But I think Kenneth Pyle is a bit, the PDF is very small, so you'll have to zoom and read. But Beasley's book is very good. Now, as far as external pressure is concerned, we can say that unlike what Barrington Moore says, it certainly did not play the major role, but it definitely hastened the process of the Tokugawas, the downfall of the Tokugawas. The growing external pressure is something that we have to acknowledge when we talk about the beginning of the 19th century. You would wonder, India and China had already come under a lot of control of the Western powers, of Britain in particular, by this time. Japan is a latecomer. Japan was not attractive for reasons that I've already cited. So it came late, but when it came with a great amount of force. So by and large, Japan was unattractive, but at the same time, and that is what meant that the threat that came from the West, number one, it came rather late, and number two, it was not as serious as in the case of the other regions of Asia. We'll just go on for 5 minutes so that the crowd can go over and then we move to Hindi. Okay. At the same time, when we look at the history of Western contact, we find the Russians were the first ones who made efforts to open up Japan. Russia is also interested in China, but Japan attracts attention because Russia wants to have trade with Japan. So the Russians were the first ones who tried to make initial attempts, but because of the presence of the sea, the initial attempts that were made by Russia were not very successful. And then, of course, after the initial attempts, by the time we come to mid-19th century, because of the Crimean War, Russia kind of lost interest. And after that, the Russian interest became highly focused on Manchuria and on China, rather than Japan. So, and Korea, Manchuria, and subsequent to that, China. Russia seems to have withdrawn from its interest in Japan. But in the meantime, we find the British and the Americans becoming more and more interested in venturing further distance from China and India, and we find that the role that was played by Britain, by France and USA acquires a much greater importance if we want to look at the contact with the outsiders. The British began to impress upon the Tokugawas to open up Japan for trade. Again, the attraction was the Japanese commodities. And Britain in any case had achieved adequately in Indian subcontinent as well as in China by this time. Remember, the Opium War had already been fought as early as 1839 to 42. So the and when we look at the British attempts, the first time that the British started insisting upon opening up Japan was at the beginning of the 19th century. Again, this was a time by which time the control of the British over India and China had been reasonably established. In fact, Britain was already carrying on opium trade with China at this time. Now, what was the Tokugawa response to this is very interesting. The Tokugawas initially continued with their rigid stand, and in fact, in 1825, in April 1825, the Tokugawas passed an order that if any foreign ship is seen in the waters surrounding Japan, they should immediately be attacked and driven. So, very rigid stance was taken by the Tokugawas. If any foreign ship is seen, it should be immediately attacked and it should be driven off. And because it violated Japanese isolation. Now, this was a stance that was taken in 1825. Now, this decree, of course, failed to create the necessary impact because it was never implemented properly. And why was it not implemented properly? Because if you look at the period, 1825 was already very well a period that could be seen as one of grave internal crisis. By early 19th century, the internal crisis and internal contradictions had already started bothering the Tokugawa. So implementation did not occur, and that further encouraged the British, the French, and of course the United States of America. Tokugawas were very much aware that although they had passed this order, they certainly would not want to get into any major military conflict, especially at a time when internally they were facing enough problems, so they wanted to avoid a direct confrontation, and that indicated the weakness of the Tokugawas. And post 1825, we find that in course of time, very rapidly in fact, the Tokugawas began to adopt a conciliatory policy. So they would not really get into any major or any kind of negative interaction with the outside. And that further encouraged all these Western countries. And of course, the final blow came from United States of America with the arrival of Commodore Perry. Commodore Perry arrived with a huge navy on the footsteps of Japan and indicated that if Japan did not comply, then an attack would happen very soon. And that took the Tokugawas completely by shock. So they surrendered very easily. I'll continue with this after a break of say 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'll take the attendance first because some people have come in late. So those of you who come in late, please do not. I will add your names later on. Of course, since you were appearing, all of you appeared for the exam. Why did you leave so early then? Did you complete your paper? Yes, ma'am. So what do? I get to half attendance or what? Open up, followed by America was followed by Britain and France and other countries, and we have series of treaties that were signed that were imposed upon Japan. If you look at the nature of these treaties, it was almost the same as the unequal treaties that were signed with China in the past. And the countries which were most active in establishing trade relations and, of course, treaties that got these countries into negotiations with Japan, and they had political repercussions also. They not only included USA, Britain, and France, but they also included Holland and Russia, and of course, Germany as well. So these treaties almost took over within a span of a very short period. Took over the economy of Japan, and the Bakufu, in fact, had to face a lot of criticism within the country for having surrendered to these Western countries. Now, as a result of these treaties, there was heavy outflow of bullion that happened, and which resulted from the relations that Japan now had with the outsiders. And as a desperate measure, the shogunate had to debase the coinage, which again went against the reputation of the Bakufu. Simultaneously, there was inflation, there was a steep rise in the prices, and particularly badly hit were the peasants who now had to purchase various kinds of paraphernalia in order to improve the agriculture in return for money. So they had to pay much more than what they were paying in the past. The prices went up. So that further added to the very negative kind of an atmosphere that prevailed in Japan. And the anti-Tokugawa group, the anti-Bakufu alliance group, by this time had already found leadership from the settle down. आइए on the floor. There. come here also. This is how the foreign vase is placed. Indigenous merchants. Please remove that Kit Kat, I'm going to take it away. Who's sitting there? Somebody who's yet to come? What's your name? Noel. You can just close the door. Please close the door. Not at all. Aryan and Bharti can check there. Please come. Yes. Take care of their bags. Return it to them after the class. So, yeah, the Anti-Bakufu Alliance had already found leadership in the four Tozama clans and took advantage of this situation to further intensify their attacks on the Tokugawas. And at this time, the press played a very important role because there was regular criticism that was carried out as far as the Tokugawa policies are concerned. Now, does this mean that the Anti-Bakufu Alliance and the Tozama clans were anti-foreign, they were anti-West, which is rather surprising because after all the Tozama clans were acquiring a lot of benefits from foreign contact via the port of Deshima. So the truth is that none of the members, none of the participants, none of the role players in the Anti-Bakufu Alliance were actually anti-West. And if you look at the Ronin, if you look at the Daimyo, if you look at the Tozama clans, they in fact were in favor of learning a lot from the West and also getting into a relationship that is going to improve the economic position of Japan. But they use this as an opportunity in order to, as a kind of a rallying point, in order to launch an attack on the Tokugawa. So they were certainly not anti-West, and they had their own negotiations, they had their own agreements with the Western powers at this point of time, and that is the reason why, in course of the downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate, the British actually came to the help of the ones who carried out this attack. Britain actually decided to help the Anti-Bakufu group. And France, which had always supported the Bakufu also, now sort of adopted a neutral stand. This was because of all the promises that had been made in the past. Noel, I'm sorry, you cannot come. Now, as far as the events are concerned, the sequence of events are concerned, the first step, definite step that was taken was in 1867, when the daimyo of one particular clan of Tozama, that is Tosa, put up the demand that the Tokugawas must resign. The Tokugawa shogun must step down. And this demand was obviously supported by the other Tozama clans and of course by the Anti-Bakufu members, the members of the Anti-Bakufu Alliance. Now, the Tokugawas at this point of time, of course, did not have a choice. Also, the impression that was carried on within the headquarters of the Tokugawas was that even if they had stepped down, they would perhaps continue to enjoy the role and continue to play the role of the chief advisor to the emperor. The Tokugawas, in fact, had acquired this confidence because of the 2.5 centuries of somewhat or rather predominantly successful rule that they had given to Japan. So the impression that the Tokugawas had was very, very positive, that they would continue to play the role of the chief advisor, and therefore the Tokugawa shogun did not show much resistance and certainly no hesitation in stepping down and surrendering the position of the shogun, giving up the title of the shogun, because it felt that it had always been loyal to the throne. Now, what was not realized by the Tokugawas was that it was not just the restoration of the imperial institution that was the objective of those who were asking the shogun to resign. The real purpose was to remove the Tokugawas once and for all, and there was very strong hatred towards the policies, towards the manner in which the administration had been carried on by the Tokugawas all this time. So it was not just the restoration of the imperial authority
the real factor which played a very important role was the immense amount of antagonism, the immense amount of hatred that every member of the anti-Bakufu alliance had towards the Tokugawa family. So there was no such offer that was made to the Tokugawas, and there was a brief civil war that was fought. The Tokugawas had their own personal guards, Hatamoto, who were loyal to them, and of course the Shimpan, who were part of the force that they used against the anti-Bakufu alliance. The anti-Bakufu alliance had a larger number, and of course the legitimacy of the anti-Bakufu fighting force was that it called itself, deliberately, consciously, it called itself the Imperial Army. The Imperial Army, the army of the emperor. So obviously, whatever sympathies there may have been with the Tokugawas were also wiped off, because it was the Imperial Army that was fighting against a group that had in fact confiscated the legitimate power of the imperial institution. So the civil war was very brief. It ended obviously in the defeat of the Tokugawas, and that brought an end to the dual system of government that was followed in the Tokugawa period. The Bakuhan system came to an end. The feudal era that can be dated back to 1180s also came to an end. The dual government, of course, had been brought into being by the Tokugawas, and it had lasted during that period of 2.5 centuries, from 1603 to 1867. And the Tokugawas were completely ousted from the position of power, and there was a declaration that happened in 1868 when a young member of the Yamato family, of the imperial royal family, was placed on the throne. And this emperor was a 14-year-old boy called Mutsuhito. Emperor Mutsuhito. He was placed on the throne in 1868, and immediately a new reign name was given to this beginning of the new rule, and that was Meiji, which means the rule of enlightenment, the enlightened rule. And this was used to signify the beginning of a new era in Japan. Now, this period of the Meijis lasted from 1868 to 1912. I've already given you the timeline of the various dynasties. And in the history of modern Japan, it is regarded as the most glorious period, because it was during this period that Japan not only acquired an identity for itself by picking and choosing, by selecting and rejecting the various aspects that had come down from several centuries, and of course borrowing a lot from the outside. Japan also became a truly modern country with a capitalist economy and with ideas that were highly inspired from the West. So the kind of modernization that we are going to be talking about in the course of our lectures is similar, is same as Westernization. Because Japan, of course, had its own model of modernization, but initially it was modernization / Westernization. So that is how we understand the Meiji period. Now, going back to the character of the downfall of the Tokugawa era, when we look at the sequence of events, they make, the study makes certain points very, very clear. Number one, it is very true that the end was inevitable. Nothing could have stopped the end of the Tokugawas. It was not a monocausal phenomenon. There were multiple causes that were responsible. And the third important point is that the end cannot be limited to 1868. Just as there is no starting point of the end, there is no end point of the end as well, being limited to a particular year. Many of the elements, many of the traits of the feudal era, the so-called feudal era of the Tokugawas, continued well into different areas of Japanese society, polity, and economy at least for another couple of decades, and maybe even beyond that. So, as far as the overall end of the Tokugawa era or the feudal era is concerned, it is usually dated to 1889. Why? Because it was in 1889 that the Meiji Constitution comes into existence. So that actually brought an end to the feudal era. But there were many elements that continued even after 1889, well into the 20th century. Examples that I cited the other day with regard to the nature of industries that are prevalent in Japan, that are running in Japan presently, are based on patterns, are based on relationships that can easily remind us of the feudal relationships that that had existed. So there was the end of course, the beginning of modernization was marked first and foremost by the end of the political hegemony of the Tokugawas, and subsequent to that, there were new objectives and there were new goals that were laid down. And what went to Japan's advantage was that Japan did not have any preset patterns. Japan had escaped the fate of India and China, so it was not difficult for the new regime, the Meiji regime, to not just undermine many of the feudal elements, if not destroy. They certainly undermined a number of feudal elements. They also found it very easy to build a new structure that was based on the needs, the unique and the typical specific needs of Japan. There was freedom, there was independence in creating models, and that was possible largely because Japan had been freed from imperialist control. So there was no stunted growth that we come across in Japan. So that is what makes the Meiji period unique. That is what makes the peculiarities of Japanese modernization / capitalism / westernization very, very interesting area to study. So that ends our first topic in the syllabus, that is downfall of the Tokugawas. Are there any questions with regard to this topic? Of course, you can keep asking questions once you've done your readings, but if there is any immediate clarification that is sought.
I had this question since last week only, but I was asking even at the end of the World War II, 1945, when Japan humiliating defeat, it had to surrender. Still, there had not been any significant revolt against the imperial system. So why was it so much revolt? I mean, of course, it was imperial system, but even in China, we see there have been so many revolts against the emperor himself. So why not that? And second question, ma'am, before the 6th century.
Can I just say something?
Yes, sure.
Why are you jumping to a period? I said any queries regarding the Tokugawa period. The other day also you asked me a question which I subsequently answered. So I would say that, of course, if it's really troubling you and giving you sleepless nights, I will clarify it. I will definitely clarify your doubt, but not here, in the tutorial class on Tuesday. So you can reserve the second question for that if it doesn't relate to this particular period. But just be a little patient. We're going to talk about all this. And your question, in fact, raises another question. Fine, there were no revolts within Japan. Why is it that the Westerners were so kind to Japanese emperor? That is my question. After the Second World War, they could have easily done away with monarchical system during the time of American occupation. So think about it, and
maybe because they understood it.
We talk about that. Yeah. So just be patient. Let us first give the poor Meijis due before we jump to the Showa dynasty and look at the predicament of the poor Hirohito. Let's talk about the Meiji period. Is it okay?
Yes, I am ready.
Yeah. But if it really troubles you, I can solve your problem and we'll have a discussion via WhatsApp or whatever. I don't want my students to go through restlessness. So, anything else regarding this period? Or,
in what sense do we mean that the feudal era ends with the end of the Tokugawa shogunate? Because
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying many of the feudal traits continue well into the 20th century. So, feudalism doesn't end. In fact, I'm contesting that. And when we look at the kind of modernization that happened, and we are doing it in phases, I'm going to keep reminding you to keep in mind the fact as to how many similarities the way in which industries were run had with the way in which feudal economy ran. No, it did not end. The same people were there in positions of power. Who was it who was enjoying the ownership of industries? Not anyone from below. No, not merchants, not peasants. It is the same feudal classes. So their way of thinking was very similar to, and I'm going to talk about that. Exactly that. Just be a little patient with me.
Now, why did the Tokugawas force the emperor to kill the imperial family?
Why didn't they?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, they would have been killed on the road. Imperial family was a sacred family. How can you kill God? There was too much significance. That explains why the source of legitimacy came from the gods. If you do anything in the name of ABCD, I'm not going to take names. Why is it that most of the political sloganeering that happens actually takes a religious form? In the name of so and so, in the name of so and so, in the name of so and so. Everything gets flattened. Got it? So that, we don't have a secular mindset. The word secular is not there. So it's never in the name of justice, it's never in the name of welfare, it's never in the name of well-being or goodness or removal of poverty. It's always in the name of, if you want success, that's how you do it. So, naturally. And that is why people are ready to crash their planes in the name of the glory of the emperor. So they dare not, and they themselves honor the emperor as a sacred figure. Ruler worship, ceremonies, rituals, all those constitute a very important part of the Japanese ethos and the cultural system. Alright, now we come to the very important topic as far as the nature is concerned. The Meiji Restoration, or what is called Meiji Ishin, I-S-H-I-N. Ishin is a Japanese term which can be interpreted as restoration, but of course it's an open term. It can also be interpreted as revolution. It can also be sometimes interpreted as revival. But the most common way of understanding Meiji Restoration is, Meiji Ishin is restoration, bringing back into place. So, what is Meiji Restoration? What is the nature of Meiji Restoration? What is the historiography that has emerged on this particular topic is what we are going to be talking about before we talk about the character. Before we talk about the changes that were brought about by the Meiji Restoration. So, if you want to understand simplistically, the Meiji Restoration basically was the victory that was acquired by the anti-Tokugawa forces that were led by the four Tozama clans when they took over the imperial palace in Kyoto and then declared the beginning of a new era under the rule of Mutsuhito, a 14-year-old emperor, the new era called Meiji. They use this word Ishin in order to signify the entire exercise. The significance of this placing on the throne of an emperor and the beginning of a new era was highlighted, was reflected and represented by the use of the term Ishin. And that basically meant that the power had been taken away from the Tokugawas and restored, given back in a way into the hands of the emperor. So this event itself is called Ishin, and the era name, of course, as I just said, was marked the beginning of a new enlightened rule of enlightenment. Now, the term Ishin was subsequently adopted. It was given a broader perspective to symbolize not just the establishment of the emperor in a strong manner, but it also symbolized and it signified the return to the ancient practices, return to the ancient institutions which were alive to and which were attached to the imperial rule. So the emperor becomes the central figure, the nucleus of this entire governmental system. So Meiji Restoration, in fact, becomes a symbol of the entire governmental system that was put in place by the Meiji leaders from 1868 onwards. And we find that this was a very major change because there had been the rule of the warriors, there had been rule of military commanders since 12th century. And that rule was finally ended. So that feudal era, what was signified as the era of feudalism, comes to an end, and we have a return to the era of imperial power. How far the feudal era had actually ended, that would answer Lavanya's question as we proceed further. And how far was the Meiji era different from the feudal era is something that we are going to take up. Now let us look at the different views that are prevalent with regard to the word restoration. There is, I will send you, I don't think I've sent it to you as yet, but I will send you some online material on historiography of Japanese history. Or I will discuss it with you in case I find it very kind of heavy. Then I will just try and make it shorter and we will discuss it in the class. But I'm giving you the skeletal framework over here. So Japanese history in any case has a very rich historiography. And let me remind you that unlike the availability of material on Chinese history, Japanese history material is available in plenty. With China, we have a problem. We are mostly dependent upon the works in English or the works that have been translated into English and they are available outside China. Otherwise, one would have to know Mandarin, one would have to have access to the Peking University. So China, by and large, is very secretive about its history. And at the most, it was available, the books that are written in the various universities of China, they are available in Taiwan. But again, in a language that we don't understand. It's not in English. It's in the Mandarin or it's in the other kind of dialects. So, yes. So it is very difficult to have access to those books, and even to transport those books to other universities creates a big problem because the Chinese government is not very open about it. But this is not the case with Japanese history. Japanese history, in fact, is available in plenty. Even if it's written in the Japanese language, the translations are available. The Japanese scholars themselves are coming out of, out of their respective areas, and they are talking about it. They welcome the study of Japanese history. So there is plenty of material that is available, and that has made it possible for the Japanese scholars to counter many of the ideas and many of the perceptions that have been found in the Western world. So, as far as Meiji Restoration is concerned, there's an entire historiography that we have, and that is what also includes a historiography on Meiji Restoration, which I'll try and share it with you, and you're most welcome to discuss it. By and large, we find that there are scholars, when we talk about Meiji Restoration, some scholars view it as a landmark in the history of modern Japan, as an event that led to revolutionary changes, that led to very, very fundamental changes. And according to these scholars, this aspect of the event becomes clear from the fact that the Meiji leaders, they set up, for the first time in the history of Japan, they set up a centralized government which can be called a national government. So that idea of nation is inculcated in the character of the nationalized government. There was no idea of nation until that time. The Tokugawas may have controlled large areas, but there were also independent entities that existed. So the idea of nation is not there. And that idea of nation is accompanied by the idea of identity of Japan. So the Meiji leaders actually transformed the way the Japanese were looking at themselves and the way the world was looking at Japan. The perceptions that were held by the Japanese and the viewpoints that were held by people outside. In addition to that, Japan was opened to Western science and Western technology, and the kind of modernization that took place in a very short span of time itself speaks of the tremendous importance of this particular event. So Meiji Restoration is regarded almost like a revolutionary change that was brought about. Of course, within this viewpoint, there are many sub-points or sub-views as well. As early as 1920s, a group of Marxist scholars in Japan who called themselves as belonging to the labor farmer group in Japanese, Ronoha, R-O-N-O-H-A, Labour Farmer Group or Ronoha. In the 1920s, this group of Marxist scholars, they viewed the Restoration as a fundamentally like a bourgeois revolution, and one which categorically ended feudalism and also laid the foundation of capitalist development. And then, of course, they critically view the pros and cons of this entire exercise. So they use the word bourgeois revolution and an event that ended feudalism and marks the beginning of capitalist development. Of course, then they of course become very critical of this kind of capitalism that is introduced in Japan. We'll go into that later. Then there is another section of Japanese Marxists who also look at it as an event that was revolutionary, that brought about a revolutionary change in Japan. So they agree with the revolutionary character, but of course, then they say that along with the Restoration, this event also sowed the seeds of authoritarianism and absolutist rule of a different kind. So they are very, very critical. Ronoha is milder. Both of them are Marxist groups, and this other group called itself the Koza group. K-O-Z-A. The Koza group. Both these groups, they refer to the revolutionary role, revolutionary transformation that took place. Of course, their approach is slightly different. The Ronoha group is milder in its criticism. The Koza group is one which says that it not only neglected the have-nots, the peasants, but it also sowed the seeds of an absolutist rule of a different kind. And they become very critical of the Meiji Restoration. But the common feature is that they are looking at this revolution as bringing about, this restoration as bringing about a revolutionary change in Japan. Now, according to Japanese scholars, however, this is the view which is usually held by and large by the Western scholars, and who also claim that this revolution was initiated by the coming of the Westerners. So they are actually presenting a very pro-West kind of a view and saying that it was possible to have this revolution because Japan simply imitated the Western models. So it was brought about in a short span of time. The Japanese scholars who came in later, they had a slightly different point of view. One of the Western scholars I would definitely want to name, and that is Hugh Gorton. H-U-G-H B-O-R-T-O-N. H-U-G-H-B-O-R-T-N. And he is an expert on Japanese history. And a very important work written by Hugh Gorton is Spanning Japan's Modern Century. Spanning Japan's Modern Century. And the very interesting phrase that he uses is, he says that Meiji leaders were planners of national economy. The Meiji leaders were planners of national economy. So he emphasizes upon the national character, he emphasizes upon the economic development. A great deal. Now, a different view is taken by Japanese scholars, amongst whom one of the major ones is Michio Nagai, Michio Nagai. Now, Michio Nagai is one of the co-editors of a book which is called Meiji Ishin, Restoration and Revolution, which is he's one of the co-editors. Meiji Ishin, Restoration and Revolution. And this was brought out in 1985. And then again republished. Another edition came out in 2011. Now, Nagai says his view is that the Meiji era should actually be seen as a period of transition, not as beginning of a new era or not a revolution, but as a period of transition. So, Meiji Restoration cannot be regarded as marking a complete break with the past. It was a mixture of the new and the old. It was certainly not a complete break from the past. It was a mixture of new and old. So this view, in fact, is one that we will go along with, because it is definitely it is definitely backed by a great amount of evidence. Then, of course, there are terms that are used for Meiji Restoration which further highlight this particular aspect, that how the earlier elements went, went into the Meiji Restoration, and therefore it cannot be regarded as a break. The typical terms that are used for this event is, for example, it is called a palace revolution. It was a palace revolution in which one section of the ruling class was replaced by another. So there was no major fundamental change that happened at the grassroots levels of society. It was a change that happened at the top. One ruling section replaced by another. Tozama replaced the Fudan, for example. And then it is also termed as an aristocratic movement, where the aristocracy remains in power. It was an aristocratic movement. There were the elites who were controlling the government earlier. Same thing continues even after that. So there was no such change that happens in the fundamental founding, or in the foundations, or in the fundamental structure. So it was an aristocratic change. The most important aspect, of course, that has drawn maximum attention from the scholars, apart from an overall nature that we just talked about, one of the most important aspects of the Meiji Restoration and the Meiji era that have attracted a lot of academic scholarship, academic debate, is the aspect of anti-feudal character. Was and can the Meiji Restoration and the Meiji era be regarded as anti-feudal? So if you are going along with the ideas as expressed by Knut Botton or by the Koza group or by the Ronoha group, one would have to definitely call it anti-feudal because it ended the feudal era. But the point is that there are a lot of problems in accepting that aspect of being totally anti-feudal. So was there an anti-feudal character? If not, then what is the evidence for this? So this is one aspect that, of course, draws our attention to the more important debate that goes on. So the fact that it was a transitional period, the fact that it was not a complete break, that fact has more or less been accepted. Now the idea is to look into the most important aspects of the Meiji Restoration, how much of anti-feudalism was there and how much of it was compromised. So regarding this, of course, we have to go into very more detailed, a much more comprehensive kind of a discussion. How far was it anti-feudal? Meiji Restoration, as we've already talked about, was a result of the decadence of a particular kind of a system, particular kind of a political, economic and social system. There was a decadence. We've already talked about the internal crisis, the one that happened during the Tokugawa era. And despite all its efforts, we've also seen how the Tokugawa shogunate could no longer keep society restricted or society confined within the rigid framework of feudal traits. It was unable, it tried its best to keep the society within that framework of highly frozen type of framework of feudalism, but it was unable to do so, and that framework just broke away. And one of the leading reasons for that was the severe economic crisis that contributed to the downfall of the Tokugawa and the establishment of the Meiji period, or led to Meiji Restoration. So, downfall is same as Meiji Restoration. Okay, so if you're asked in the exams, and why I'm telling you this, I know all of you have already understood, but there was a mistake that was made by the students in that particular year. The question was Meiji Restoration was a result of internal and external crisis. Now they saw the word Meiji Restoration, they started talking about nature, they started talking about the early reforms, they started talking about everything about Meiji Restoration and nothing about how it came into being. So this question is same as Tokugawa downfall happened as a result of internal crisis and external pressure. So just be careful about that. Okay, coming back to the character of Meiji Restoration. So we find that when we look at Meiji Restoration, from a distance, the two major themes that dominate the entire event and sequence of events after 1868 is number one, destruction of, if not all, many feudal characters. That is one. That is one theme. The Meiji leaders, in a very systematic manner, they went about demolishing various characteristics of the earlier era. To give you one example, samurai was ended. Samurai, that hierarchical structure was done with. No daimyo, no samurai, that rigid hierarchical structure was done with. And there was mobility that was introduced. So that is one aspect. So systematic destruction of, if not all, many feudal elements. The second aspect is concentration of power in a new central government. Now these are the principal themes upon which concentration of power in a new central government. These are the two principal themes on which Meiji Restoration was based. So, from a distance, one can conclude that we cannot overlook, we cannot deny the anti-feudal character, we cannot underplay the anti-feudal character of the Meiji Restoration. The rider is that at the same time, while we cannot deny or underplay the anti-feudal character, we also have to make note of continuation of certain feudal elements. That cannot be overlooked. So with that kind of dilemma before us, how do we proceed? We'll talk about that on Tuesday. Okay? Any questions? So you're free from tomorrow. Tomorrow. Then of course we are subject to